Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com joins me. Puzzle for everyone. Defense Department right now is dealing with a mystery, a close air encounter within these last days. It was revealed by the Defense Department over this is East Asia, over the South China Sea. A Chinese J-11 fighter came within 20, 30 feet. It's sometimes debated, but that's too close, of a U.S. Navy P-8 aircraft, a surveillance aircraft designed to track submarines. This incident illustrates a challenge for the United States Navy, for the policy in Washington. What is to be done with the increasingly aggressive PLA Navy and PLA Air Force against our allies, Japan, the Philippines, against those who may or may not be our allies, Vietnam, in fact, the aggression throughout the South China Sea. Gordon and I welcome our colleague James Holmes, professor at the Naval War College, co-author of Red Star Over the Pacific, China's Rise and the Challenge to U.S. Maritime Strategy. James, you and Toshi Yasuhara anticipated this some years in constructing your book because the challenge to U.S. maritime is quite evident in the presentation. But here we have a challenge in the air over the South China Sea. Has something changed, James, since you originally looked at the rise of the PLA and the Navy and the Air Force? Has there been a change in leadership that leads to these confrontations? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Good evening, Gordon. I actually don't think there's been a huge change, except for the fact that that China has developed the physical wherewithal to put more teeth into what it wants to do over the South China Sea, over the East China Sea, and other places that where it claims what it calls indisputable sovereignty. Keep in mind that if you study international relations, sovereignty means that domestic law rules there. That's what the Chinese mean when they talk about indisputable sovereignty over the vast majority of the South China Sea and elsewhere within the first island chain. So I think this is a long-standing policy. The Chinese have actually, to their credit, been rather forthright in telling us what they want. They don't always divulge the tactics that they're going to use to get it, but at the same time, they've let us know that they want to regulate what goes on there. So this is a long-standing policy. When I heard about the P-8 incident that you just referred to from last week, I and anybody else who studies China almost immediately would have thought back to 2001 with the collision between a similar aircraft, the EP-3 aircraft, and a Chinese fighter jet, which resulted in the U.S. Navy plane landing on Hainan Island and otherwise gave rise to a diplomatic incident. So I think physical capability gives China the ability to be more assertive about what it's trying to do, but the policy is very consistent over the past quite a few years.
James, what is the thinking in the Navy about China? There have been many attempts on the part of the United States, especially the Navy, to cooperate and engage with the Chinese. And so, for instance, at RIMPAC 2014, which is the world's largest naval exercise, the Chinese were invited this time. So soon after RIMPAC 14, you have this incident over the South China Sea when some very dangerous Chinese flying and intercept of our P-8. What does the Navy really think about its ability to push the Chinese in better directions when it comes to these incidents on the sea and over the sea?
Well, let me say two things, Gordon. I mean, one is the sort of the obvious thing is that I am not speaking for the Navy. If I say something, if I voice a view on your show or anywhere else, most likely it is not the Navy's official view. So that's point one. Point two, with regard to the Navy, I think the Navy hopes, and indeed the Navy wants to give China every possibility, every opportunity to be what we call a responsible stakeholder, to help take ownership of the liberal international order over which the United States has presided for many years, and to which China has signed on to by signing and ratifying the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the other accords that regulate what goes on in international airspace and waters. So the United States, by concluding the Convention on Unplanned Encounters at Sea and so forth, this is what the administration and the Navy are trying to do. They don't want to be seen, and they don't want to foreclose any opportunity to cooperate with China. I guess there's actually a third point. I think with regard to what happened with regard to the exercises off Hawaii, and then this incident following so close on the heels of that apparently rather successful exercise, is that the For China, the rules are different depending on where on the map you are. If you're in the China Seas, clearly China sees vital interest in asserting control of those waters and skies. Once you get outside the island chains, you get farther and farther away from Asian shores, then the rules are different. It's possible for China to cooperate the way it did off Hawaii, the way it has done in the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean with the counter-piracy expedition for many years. So you have to keep in mind that the rules for China are not always the same.
Well, it seems to be that if you look at the seas between 12 and 200 nautical miles, that's the exclusive economic zone, yes, where a country doesn't have sovereignty but does have the right to exploit the seabed for minerals and fish and whatever. In that 12 to 200 mile zone, the Chinese are now starting to say the U.S. Navy has no right to go when you start looking at their statements that they've made since the August 19th incident. From the United States point of view, that's international water. And for more than 2 centuries, the U.S. has defended freedom of navigation. It seems to me that there's a conflict here that just cannot be squared. What do you think?
I think there's a good point. I mean, I actually think our administration has done rather well on this recently. Back to when Secretary Clinton in the 2010 timeframe, about this time in 2010, declared that the United States saw a national interest in freedom of navigation through those waters, those international waters. As you pointed out, coastal states only have that full sovereignty over a belt of water about 12 miles, or not about, exactly 12 miles from their shores. The waters between there and 200 miles are considered international waters. They're open to the free use of any nation that's able to use them, except for, as you pointed out, the ability to fish, to extract natural resources, and so on and so forth. So there's a key disparity there. But there's a difference between freedom of navigation, and our Chinese friends will tell us that they do not oppose freedom of navigation within these waters that we're talking about. But by navigation, they define that explicitly, very narrowly, as navigation, as the ability to pass from point A to point B while doing nothing in between. This is quite a different concept from freedom of the seas and freedom of the skies, as has been practiced in the global commons for many centuries now. Military forces are allowed to do surveillance flights, as the P-8 aircraft was doing. They're allowed to take soundings and do all these sorts of things, as long as they are not extracting those natural resources. So the Chinese are taking a very narrow view of freedom of the seas, and the United States is adhering to the traditional view that has prevailed really since the 17th century.
James, the challenge to a U.S. aircraft, that clearly indicates that China is ready to intimidate, and the people who would most likely be intimidated would be our allies without the ability to put out aircraft carriers and battle groups, and that would be the Philippines and Vietnam first of all, but Japan and South Korea don't have navies comparable to ours. If the Chinese can do this to a U.S. Navy aircraft and there's no consequence, we've wandered into moral hazard, haven't we, James? And we've told the Philippines, you're on your own, guys.
Yeah, I think that's the calculation. I think China, a big part of it, the obvious reason that they would do it is to try to dissuade, to try to deter the United States from doing this sort of thing in the first place. But the secondary purpose, a very comparable purpose, as you point out, would be to dishearten our allies, to persuade Japan, South Korea, and especially Vietnam, these much weaker powers in the Philippine Islands, that the United States cannot come to their aid, and that if they are left facing China one-on-one, that they simply have no chance of standing up. So China would essentially be able to more or less overawe them into submission. This is a very traditional Chinese way of thinking about strategy. Win without fighting, build up such power that your opponent simply cannot stand against you, and therefore will bow to your will.
James, quickly,
yep.
In a street fight, first punch wins. Did the Chinese just win?
I don't think I would go that far. I think there's still remaining to be said. This is really a test of wills. Again, we're in what we call peacetime strategic competition. It is a test of wills, but using military forces as the implements of that test. I think our administration has probably lost a step and is behind the Chinese, but I'm not sure that I would be willing to capitulate yet.
James Holmes with his colleague Toshio Shihara. They're the authors of Red Star Over the Pacific, China's Rise and the Challenge to U.S. Maritime Strategy, a prescient book given the incident of these last days. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. The Philippines, Gordon, the Philippines. What is the Philippines going to make of the fact that we don't stand up for our surveillance aircraft? I'm John Batchelor.